Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, I would like to thank Majority Leader Winkler for his leadership on this important issue. His thoughtfulness and thoroughness in hearing directly from the people across Minnesota on such an important issue is much appreciated. And my friend, Representative Aisha Gomez, and the many of you who in the legislature and from the community who worked so hard on crafting this very important legislation. Colleagues, I stand in support of House File 600 because it's long overdue that Minnesota gets on board with so many other great states in giving people a choice in a deeply personal decision regarding the use of cannabis. It's long overdue that we allow people who are informed adults to make their own decisions. It's also long overdue that we right an historical wrong, which is undoing systems of oppression and persecution for which decades have disproportionately targeted and affected the poor and communities of color. So often and for so long, our war on drugs have been wars in poverty, class, and race. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. Cannabis sales were now taxed. Part of the reason this act was passed was because of the fear-mongering going on at the time. And a huge instigator of that fear-mongering was the man behind the Marijuana Tax Act, Harry Anslinger. Anslinger was named the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics during the Prohibition era. Once national prohibition ended in 1933, Anslinger turned his focus to marijuana. This is when racism and xenophobia was at its height in a country that was ever expanding and welcoming more immigrants of color and those from darker hues in poorer countries. Anslinger took the scientifically unsupported idea of marijuana as a violence-inducing, connected it to Black and Latino people, and created a perfect package of terror to sell to the American media and public. By emphasizing the Spanish word marijuana instead of cannabis, he created a strong association between the drug and Mexican immigrants. He also created a narrative around the idea that cannabis made Black people forget their place in society. He pushed the idea that jazz was evil music created by people under the influence of marijuana. Anslinger did not hide his prejudice with comments like, and I quote, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, results from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and others," unquote. By painting the drug as a scourge from the south of the border to a jazz drug, to the corruptive intoxicant of choice for beatniks and hippies, marijuana as a drug and the laws that sought to control it played on some of America's worst tendencies around race, ethnicity, civil disobedience, and otherness. This direct line of racism in policy was caught on tape officially of 30 years later in the making of the Controlled Substance Act, which would put marijuana on the Schedule I drug list. Thanks to the Nixon tapes, we heard the truth about policymakers using drug laws as a front to go after leaders of color, as my colleague, Representative Jess Hansen, so eloquently noted what John Ehrlichman, a senior advisor to Nixon, had said. It's time to undo the things which no longer make sense. It's time to restructure and rebuild systems which no longer serve our society, and it's never too late to right a wrong. This bill would allow anyone over 21 to buy cannabis from a licensed retailer and expunge records for those with past misdemeanor cannabis convictions. This is a game changer. John Hudick, a political scientist and scholar, He is the deputy director at the Center for Effective Public Management and senior fellow for the governance studies at the Brookings Institution. He wrote a very important book in 2016 on the political and policy history of cannabis called Marijuana: A Short History. And I give you a quote. For decades, the criminal justice system in the United States extracted from Black and brown America money, human beings, and opportunity. The legal cannabis industry can help return what was taken. The history of cannabis policy demonstrates that racism was institutionalized and enforced in specific communities, and it is now legalization that must institutionalize the means for their recovery. End quote. Let us come together to make a meaningful policy changes that will uplift all of our communities. Let us come together to fix a system for too long was designed to not work on purpose. There is no shame in calling that out. In fact, there's absolute courage and integrity as public officials and the duly elected people who were sent here by our fellow Minnesotans. They demand that much. They deserve that much. It's time to right some wrongs. It's time to make progress. It's time to do the right thing. Let's all allow the use of recreational adult use of cannabis now. Thank you, Madam Speaker.